So a few frameworks to understand this. This is a story of capacity building, and that story also sort of points the way to how to fight this story. In the first evolution of democracy promotion, it was pumping in propaganda, pro-US or pro-UK propaganda to countries around the world during the Cold War. And so we built things like Voice America and Radio Free Europe. This was what these things were piped in to do. Today, this will come not from the CIA directly, but from CIA intermediated soft power fronts like USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, or things like Internews, which played a big role in the censorship story, for example, in Brazil. But this first evolution in media soft power by this foreign policy establishment was about effective intelligence and diplomatic control of media in order to control the political ecosystems, because the military became downstream of that after World War II. All of this was fought at the subversive political level.
We just fought a war, and in a war you conduct all sorts of operations, deception operations, sabotage, all the rest of it. And I was involved in that, and the OSS was involved in that. As the danger of Stalin's expansion seemed to be threatening to sweep around and cover more of the world, we developed a CIA in order to conduct the subversive level of the struggle.
And this is not like a giant conspiracy. This is Frank Wisner, the godfather of the CIA, as he bragged about his own, quote, Wisner's Wurlitzer, a worldwide network of thousands of foreign media outlets on 6 continents, including some here in the US, which they got in trouble for in the 1970s. A third of their budget went to media control. This is the Central Intelligence Agency. I just had a couple of things that they're authorized under NSC 10-2 to do, which include propaganda, economic warfare, sabotage, demolition, assistance to underground resistance movements, etc. This concept of capacity building is very important, because what you see in country by country is a building up of a capacity in order to do this censorship work. You see these university centers pop up. You have a white shoe university that's been in the country for 200, 300 years, and all of a sudden they've got a new lab in their communications department, or in their advanced physics department, or in their computational data science department. What I'm trying to describe here with the role of the US and UK governments is the creation of a capacity very deliberately to do this, understanding a little bit about the relationship between these three categories who do this. Why do you see the military in this? Why do you see intelligence in this? Why do you keep seeing the State Department and the UK Foreign Office and all of this? Well, it's because they have this license under national interest, which is a broader mandate than national security. The Department of Defense and the UK Ministry of Defense operate on a sort of national security. Do you threaten us, or do you think we threaten you, or can we create some pretext to say that you're threatening us? Okay, now we can launch into action. But the State Department and the UK Foreign Office, it's parallel, have a broader mandate, which is national interest. Even if no one's threatening us, we can still overthrow their government. We can still build up a political resistance group. We can still bribe the endogenous news organizations to censor stories and things like that, because we are doing dirty deeds abroad, but for the benefit. It's a mean, nasty world out there. If we don't do it, then somebody else will. But the DoD does hearts and minds work under the Psychological Operations Branch, and NATO began to do this right after Crimea. This was. So Sweden has something, for example, called the Sweden Psychological Defense Agency, and you will often see this referred to as psychological inoculation or psychological resilience, and then they'll just call it resilience because they don't want to sound like they're psyching with you. But this is DoD work. This is hearts and minds work. This is information shaping work that DoD does. This is why you're going to see things like the 77th Brigade in the UK, and why you're going to see things like military funding and DARPA grants to all these censorship industry participants in the US. On the State Department and USAID side, you have the capacity building of a network. The capacity means running money and resources into a network so that those assets can be instrumentalized for a purpose. In this case, the purpose being censorship. And then the CIA's role is really liaising and providing direction to the already capacity-built networks that are getting State Department, USAID funding, and in coordination where necessary with the military. And again, what makes this so powerful is that they have a government-licensed Department of Dirty Tricks. They're not subject to the standard protections against information control that U.S. citizens have. And I just wanted, with my remaining time, I sort of want to demystify this, because it's, like I said, it is the end of the world, so it's a big deal that way, but it's not a big deal in the sense that this is actually completely ordinary course, and you could be talking about this in a State Department hallway without batting an eyelash, because this is just normal stuff. Okay, the the empire's empire's eye view of the world is that there is no such thing as domestic policy. Every country's domestic policy is another country's foreign policy because it impacts another country's national interests. Each foreign country, therefore, has a foreign policy interest in influence or ramming through changes to other countries' own domestic policies. Someone has to do that influencing or ramming job. In the US, and it's really a transatlantic thing with the UK, we call that the foreign policy establishment, the Blob. Milton Friedman has this great video on how you can't even make a pencil in the United States without going abroad. And he sort of fashioned that into a sort of libertarian political argument around the amazingness of the free market. But it actually provides a kind of interesting way to understand why it is that everyone converged on this at the military and intelligence and State Department level, which is that you can't even make a pencil in America without going to a foreign land. In this Milton Friedman video goes over how the wood is cut down from a tree in Colombia, and the graphite is mined somewhere in Argentina, and the gum comes from a tree in Malaysia. And so what happens if you don't have a blob, if you don't have a soft power apparatus to influence the internal politics of another country? So for example, say you need the compressed graphite from mines in South America. What happens if the South American government nationalizes the graphite industry there and no longer allows American companies in? If you still want pencils, you need a blob to go in and influence that government and influence that country's electorate in order to prevent that nationalization. What if the foreign government is on board, but the holdup is a specific faction within that foreign country's population? For example, what if the miners in the graphite industry there are striking or protesting labor conditions or successfully lobbying for labor laws that would make pencil sales unprofitable? If you still want pencils in America, you need a blob, you need a foreign policy establishment, you need this cloak and dagger apparatus to have a capacity, even if they don't use it. You need a pre-built capacity in place to go in and do that hearts and minds work to influence those labor unions, to influence those voters and influence those court systems in order to make sure that we have pencils here in the United States. So what does this look like in a typical case? First, the Blob would send a State Department delegation to tell them not to nationalize the graphite mines. If that fails, they might negotiate. If that fails, they might threaten economic sanctions. If that fails, they might seek to create leverage by destabilizing their government counterparts and then going back to the negotiating table and offering to end the destabilization in exchange for ending the graphite nationalization. And if that fails, they may need to orchestrate a coup, a regime change. They may need to provide, for example, in the case of Yugoslavia, $72 million to the political opposition party in order to effectively rig their elections and do everything we accused Russia of on steroids in 2016. So the intended purpose of the Blob is to do this. And again, the Blob is this diplomacy, defense, intelligence apparatus, our foreign policy department of dirty tricks. For example, how would the Blob classically go about changing the hearts and minds of those trade labor unions in South America's graphite mines if we want pencils in the United States? First, the State Department, USAID, and the National Endowment for Democracy would flood the zone with millions of dollars of so-called independent media in the region to create a surround sound of media messaging. So you would work with the biggest media groups in the country. For example, as they did in Brazil. Globo is the largest media group in Brazil. The State Department worked with Globo. They had Midan, who gets friggin' DARPA funds, provided the WhatsApp surveillance stuff that ended up being in Globo's fact checker network. NED worked through something like NDI and the D4D coalition. But they would flood the zone in the same way they did with that $5 billion in Ukraine. You would see a flood of media organizations, both legacy media organizations where you'd have that back channel, and then new pop-up news organizations, independent media organizations that would all create that surround sound. Next, the State Department and the CIA, either directly or through pass-throughs, would identify the most influential institutions in the graphite trade labor unions there and get their leaders funded by USAID, partnered with NED, or sinecured otherwise by the US government. You get them on payroll. At the same time, the State Department would fund grantees to create a swarm of new institutions in the trade labor union cause in the region, getting a critical mass of local workers on U.S. payroll. At the same time, they would fund local university centers to get labor academics on U.S. payroll and partner with and fund institutions associated with the country's judiciary so that the country's courts would be hostile to that country's new labor law proposal. Each of these actions require a capacity. Institutions capable of exerting soft power on that country's foreign population and that foreign country's government. So the government must build up the capacity of that, lots and lots and lots and lots of them. And you can imagine that in a really big region, this sprawl looks friggin' enormous. And I'll just give you like a just like a short thing, for example, of what happened in Brazil, because they descended on it like a pack of vultures. Now, these are all entities funded by the U.S. government. Now, red is funding, and the green refers to their direct intermediation work. So you have the U.S. State Department, which does our overt diplomacy. You have the CIA, which does our covert diplomacy. And you have USAID, which is sort of the entity that straddles the two of them, in the sense that it's formally overt, in the sense that it is a U.S. government agency, unlike the National Endowment for Democracy, which again was created by the CIA but it's not really the CIA. It's actually an independent thing that we came up with. But the world bought it, and so we live in the aftermath of their ignorance. But essentially, USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy created this program called CEPS, the Center for Excellence in Political Process Strengthening. They get $150 million a year from the State Department in order to get other countries to pass censorship laws. And they have 20 million of their 150 million budget went specifically to Brazil. Now, CEPS gets its money from the National Endowment for Democracy, from the NDI, which is the DNC branch of it, the IRI, which is the RNC branch of the CIA, and this thing called IFES, the International Foundation for Election Systems. And CEPS created this program in Brazil to get Brazil's TSE, to get their election court to pass these progressive layers of censorship laws. This started in 2018 when they descended on them. They capacity built the Atlantic Council, the Wilson Center, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. By the way, the Atlantic Council has 7 CIA directors on its board. It gets annual funding from the Pentagon, the State Department, and the National Endowment for Democracy. The Wilson Center gets about 90%, or I think it gets a third of its budget from the U.S. government. The Wilson Center is where Nina Jankovic came from. The Wilson Center also hosts an amazing CIA archive that I actually pulled the inauguration of organized political warfare from later in the slide presentation. That actually comes from the Wilson Center CIA archive. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which was run from 2014 to 2021 by a guy named Bill Burns. He left in 2021. If you're wondering what he's doing now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because he is the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. MEDAM, which is funded by the U.S. State Department and has also gotten DARPA grants. Pointer, which has about, 35 different, that's the international fact-checking, independent fact-checking network, which happens to have something like 35 State Department grants alone and is completely back-channeled by this whole network. Every single one of these worked in tandem with the TSE. They actually met with the officials. They flew them to the U.S. They went to Brazil to coordinate. They actually formally partnered with them. For example, the Atlantic Council is one of the 67 partnered institutions of the TSE. Even EIP was a part of this. Emerson Brookings and several others had direct meetings. Actually did training workshops for how to get TSE to understand the disinformation challenge from 2018 onward. Meanwhile, it was actually the National Endowment for Democracy's union branch, which gave Lula, the AFL used to be called the AFL-CIA in the 1960s because it was so penetrated by the Central Intelligence Agency. Somehow that history has been forgotten to the populist right, but the NED has 4 branches. One of them is the NDI and the IRI. Another one is called CPAY. It's the Center for International Private Enterprise. That's the Chamber of Commerce. That's the big business wing of the CIA. But the fourth of their core 4s is something called the Solidarity Center, which was named for the CIA's work essentially with the Solidarity Movement. I think it was a good thing that Poland, became a free country. If they weren't doing this to us, I'm not sure I would have a problem with it, but they're friggin' doing it to us, so we need to understand all this. So their 4th entity is called the Solidarity Center. Now, the Solidarity Center played a major role in Lula's political emergence and his reemergence after his prison term. And the Solidarity Center gave Lula their Man of the Year award in 2021 when he was preparing his, while the National Endowment for Democracy is creating every single one of these are U.S. government funded or in U.S. government back channel. They're a part of the CEPS Disinformation Partner Network in Brazil. This is just, and by the way, I was having spacing trouble. There's about 3 dozen more. But they created a swarm army of soft power institutions in order to get Brazil to kneecap WhatsApp and Telegram and then finally X. And in fact, the National Endowment for Democracy, a guy named Dean Jackson there, even penned an op-ed a month and a half ago where he said that Elon Musk, and this again, the National Endowment for Democracy, this is the CIA, created by the CIA director, and he wrote this letter saying that Elon Musk is now a bigger threat than Putin or Xi because it's a more proximal threat. And because of his ties to the U.S. national defense establishment through SpaceX and the role of Tesla in the green revolution, that he's a stickier target. So we need to really sort of elevate the threat that Elon poses, because we're not doing enough to stop him yet. Now, this is, again, the same organization that gets all of its budget from USAID by way of the U.S. State Department, which was created by the CIA. It actually is a license to back channel with the CIA under as long as it's approved by the Senate Intelligence Committee. So everything that happened in Brazil, they built some of these now again, these, and there's about a dozen more just on the U.S. side. And again, I tried to put flags here. These look like they're Brazilian entities. In Australia, these will look like they are endogenous to Australia. It will look like an Australian university, an Australian newspaper. But they are getting their money from a U.S. government program. They are being back-channeled by U.S. diplomatic efforts to do the judicial reform in the country, to install a capacity to censor the rise of political movements. And I want to just, sorry, if I have time for just one last thing. So I have this document